The start of the Premier League is nearly upon us, and it's time for me to do my Premier League predictions. The stakes are pretty high because last season I only got one position right out of all 20 Premier League clubs, so hopefully I could do a little bit better this time. And the way I'm going to be formatting these predictions is with the power of a tier list, and we're going to be starting with who I think will finish rock bottom of the Premier League in 20th place. No, it's not Man United. It is actually Nottingham Forest, and that's a shame because I do like Forest, and they are technically the weakest side in the Premier League. Required the playoffs to come up, and they were arguably fortunate in that playoff final. I'm going to preface basically everything I say by just noting that I did not watch the Championship last season, so a lot of what I'm basing the Championship predictions on is on data. Shout out Will. Now, Forest did perform very well last season in terms of goals against. This is Forest here. Only conceded 40 goals, and actually only Bournemouth in the whole division conceded fewer. Even Fulham conceded more than Nottingham Forest. But what is this table right in front of you? It is shots against per 90 minutes. Not a perfect stat, I appreciate it, but it's what I've got to base this off. Now, if we look at this, West Brom were actually the best in terms of facing the fewest shots against, unsurprisingly. Then you've got Fulham and Bournemouth, the promoted sides. But to get to Forest, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So Forest were actually 9th best in the Championship last season in terms of shots against. And also, if we go to saves ratio, Forest are 2nd best in terms of save percentage. Again, I appreciate these aren't perfect stats, but what that does at least inform me to an extent is that Forest probably should have conceded more goals last season than they did. Up against Premier League quality forwards, I do think that could be potentially where Forest come unstuck. But there's more to it than that in my prediction, because let's have a look at Forest transfer activity. Starting with a comparison of squad value based on the end of last season compared to now. 110% increase in their squad value from just under 69 million all the way up to 140 million pounds. That sounds very good. That sounds very promising. Let's take a closer look at the actual signings. The issue for me is that they've potentially brought in around 10 players who could be first teamers. This is the key signing, this Taiwo, centre forward. Played for Union Berlin last season, got 15 goals and 2 assists in 31 Bundesliga matches for Union Berlin. Is that going to correlate over to the Premier League? I'm not so sure. Other main signing is Nico Williams. Every time I've seen him play, he's not been great. 18 million seems like a lot. Seems like a lot for Williams. He was a bit part player in Fulham's title win. He's actually got more caps for Wales than Premier League appearances. And despite all of the signings, this is a table of squad value overall. Forest still have the 2nd lowest squad value out of all the Premier League clubs. Only Bournemouth is actually lower. So they've brought in lots of players. And there's also that issue of amalgamating all of those players into one team very quickly. So it's going to take a lot of time to embed all of those players. They've made some interesting transfers, getting Jesse Lingard on a free, getting Henderson on a loan from United. These are Premier League quality players. I don't know why. I just really fear for Forest, and I do think they will finish rock bottom of the Premier League. Coming in at 19th place, I've got another newly promoted side, and I do think that, unfortunately, it's another club that I want to do well. As of my predictions, actually, Bournemouth had not made a signing. They now have, and in fact, let's take a closer look at the signings that they've actually made. If we go here, we did talk earlier about how Bournemouth's club value is the worst in the Premier League. They have finally signed a player. They finally signed a player. Well, they signed Rothwell and Fredericks before then, but on freeze. They've now actually spent some money on Tavernier from Borough. Again, I've been informed by Will, the Borough fan, that he is literally world class and is better than Messi. However, for me, it's not that inspired. I do like Scott Parker as a manager, but I do think they fundamentally need more players. I also have huge doubts on one Dominic Solanki. I don't really know how good he is. He did play every game last season for Bournemouth and scored 29 goals. However, there's a huge step up between the Championship and the Premier League. And the fact is that Solanki has played 63 Premier League games in his career so far, and he scored 4 goals. Goals are the currency of football. I don't think Bournemouth are going to score enough goals, and I do think that's why they will get relegated. The final side I've got for relegation, it's not a newly promoted one. Bit of a controversial one, maybe. I'm going for Southampton ahead of Bournemouth. They will just get relegated. Now, I did predict them to finish in this position last season, and they did just survive, but only 5 points off Burnley in 15th place. That 15th place looks more comfortable than it actually is. And the reason why I've tipped them for relegation once again is, frankly, I don't think they're that good. Let's have a look at their transfer activity as well, because this is something I just don't understand. They seem to be obsessed with Manchester City's academy, and I don't quite know why. Bazanu, over £12 million, hasn't played a Premier League game for City. He actually played in League One last season. Lavia, again, over £11 million, has not played a Premier League game. And there's also interest in Liam Delap for a fee of over £20 million. So we're talking about around £40 million for 3 players who have a collective number of Premier League appearances of 1. I just think they need a clinical striker as well. James Ward-Prowse was their highest goal scorer last season. A lot of that inflated by set pieces, and that's why I do think they will get relegated. Let's move on to teams that will just survive. Fulham will just survive. They will finish in 17th place. They've been a yo-yo club in recent years. I just think they will pick Southampton there. And Mitrovic could be key to that. He did score 43 goals in 44 appearances last season, breaking the championship all-time goal scoring record, even achieving 7 assists as well. So 50 goal contributions in 44 games for Fulham. However, the question with championship strikers is, can you translate that form, that goal-scoring form from the championship over to the Premier League? Well, the past trends suggest that isn't the case. If you look at these peaks and troughs, where do you think the peaks are? Where do you think the troughs are? This is when he's in the Premier League, gets 0.3 goals a game in 18-19. This is when he's in the Championship, gets 0.65 goals a game. This is when he's in the Premier League, 0.19 goals a game. This is when he's in the Championship, gets 1.01 goals a game. The peaks are when he's in the Championship, the troughs are when he's in the Premier League. So the past trend suggests he cannot replicate that goal-scoring form. Who knows, maybe this is his year. All that being said, they were the best side in the Championship by a fair margin. The signings look decent. Another team that would just about survive is Everton. They will finish in 16th place. Now, if you've been following the channel for any amount of time, then you'll know that I think Everton are shambles of a club. There is no correlation in terms of their transfer strategy. There's no correlation in terms of their manager recruitment strategy. There's a remarkable lack of identity and cohesion at that club, and I do think they will be fighting against relegation. I don't know if I really rate Richarlison that highly. However, for a team like Everton, he was very important. So the fact they've lost him, he scored a lot of key goals for them last season. That might be the difference between them staying up and not staying up. But either way, I do think they will just about stay up. On the other hand, I do think that Tarkowski is an excellent signing from Burnley. Everyone knows that I rate Burnley's centre-halves, particularly Tarkowski and me. And I do think that will actually give them some form of solidity at the back. Everton had the 5th worst defence last season. All that being said, I do think they need to do more. They need to keep Dominic Calvert-Lewin fit. Fundamentally, he only played 17 games last season, and generally speaking, the squad is lacking in any sort of overall quality, and I would be surprised if Lampard lasted the whole season. Leeds are coming in 15th place. They've basically raided Red Bull, whether that's Leipzig or Salzburg. They brought in Aronson, Tyler Adams and Christensen, and you'd like to think that Jesse March, who used to manage both Leipzig and Salzburg, would have a lot of knowledge on these players. He better add to, because it's a fee of around £60 million for these 3 players. In terms of outgoings, they probably lost arguably their 2 most valuable players. Rafinha was their top goal scorer, but it looks like they've potentially invested that money wisely. Again, I'm assuming Jesse Marsh knows what he's doing. But last season, I thought that Leeds were quite fortunate to not get relegated. They had the worst record in terms of yellow cards, around 20 more than the next worst. And also from a defensive standpoint, only Norwich were worse than Leeds in terms of goals conceded and XG against. The last team in this section is Brentford. I think Brentford will finish in 14th place. For me, Brentford had one of the most impressive seasons last season. And they also haven't lost any of their key players, unless you include Christian Eriksen, who was brought in on a short-term deal. They brought in a couple of potentially interesting players. I don't know too much about these guys, if I'm being totally honest. However, this is the player who I do know a lot about, Ben Mee. Everyone knows that I really like Ben Mee. He can bring in some leadership and defensive nous into that Brentford side. Under Thomas Frank, they're going to keep doing what we know that they do in terms of their Moneyball finance strategy, so I do trust them in terms of these signings. I thought Aston Villa were one of the most disappointing sides in the league last season. I'm putting them in 13th place this season, and part of that thinking is I'm not entirely convinced by Steven Gerrard as a manager yet. He had one of the most valuable squads in the league last season, the 9th most valuable actually, and the thing is that Villa have a lot of good players. Louise, Watkins, McGinn, Buendia, Mings, Martinez, Digne, Bailly. These are all really good players, so I am surprised that Gerrard didn't do better than I thought he may have done last season. In terms of their incomings, they brought in Europa League winner Diego Carlos. They've also signed Coutinho permanently now. They've got a strong squad. They really should be fighting for Europe, but ultimately, I do think that once again, they're going to flatter to deceive. In 12th place, I have Wolves. Quick quiz question. Do you know who's the top goal scorer in the Premier League at Molineux last season? It's two players, actually. One is Jimenez, but the other is Kevin De Bruyne. They both scored 4 goals. Wolves are such an odd team, I don't really know what to make of them. In terms of their incomings, they've signed the least interesting of the Burnley centre-halves. Hwang isn't really a new signing, he's just a confirmation. But my fundamental issue with Wolves is that they're so reliant on their strong defensive record. In terms of goals against, it is very promising. Only City, Liverpool, Chelsea and Spurs conceded fewer goals than Wolves, and their 43 goals conceded. However, when we then come to goals scored, only Norwich, Burnley, Watford scored fewer goals than Wolves. And what do you notice about all these sides? They were relegated. Only Burnley and Norwich performed worse than Wolves in terms of shot creating actions per 90. In terms of goal creating actions per 90, only Burnley, Watford and Norwich did worse than Wolves. Again, these were all relegated. You might say, well, it works for them, obviously, as long as they can keep up that defensive record, then they should be fine. But I don't think this is sustainable. Because just take a look at the post-shot expected goals minus goals allowed. If you don't know what the stat means, basically, it's an indication of how well your goalkeeper has performed from a shot-stopping perspective. And Wolves are right at the top there. It's literally the best in the league. And what that means, basically, is that Jose Sarr, Wolves' goalkeeper, was the best in the league last season in terms of shot-stopping. They should have conceded around another 8 goals than they actually did. So their defensive numbers last season were very impressive, but that's in part due to how well Jose Sarr, their goalkeeper, performed. And it's not reasonable to expect him to be able to perform like that again next season or the season after. I think that unless Wolves are able to just find more shots and find more goals from somewhere, I actually wouldn't be surprised if they finish lower than 12th, because having a good defense will only get you so far, especially with what I deem to be these unsustainable stats. Wolves do need to start scoring more and creating more. Brighton. I really like Brighton, and they are going to finish in 11th place. Graham Potter is one of my favourite managers. They were, in fact, only, look at that, they're actually only 5 points off West Ham last season. That's how close Brighton were. However, what I would say about them is that they are at risk, and indeed they are, losing their best players. Let's have a look at their transfer activity, because it makes for some pretty grim reading if you are a Brighton fan. There's Graham Potter, what a beautiful man. They've already lost Basuma to Spurs. I think Basuma was a very good player for Brighton. They've lost him. Cucurella is another one who hasn't gone yet. He was potentially going to City. It looks almost certain that he is going to be going to Chelsea. In terms of their incomings, again, these are two relative unknowns who I cannot comment on at all. I've no idea how good they're going to be. So I imagine that for Brighton, unless some signings come in, they're going to be reliant on the existing squad without Basuma and without Cucurella. That being said, I do love Potter. He got Brighton to 9th, even though they actually underperformed on their XG. And for me, it's sort of a similar situation to Southampton. I do think that the club needs a clinical striker. Morpay, for example, seems to be their main option as a striker. And last season he scored 8 goals, and the season before that he scored 8 goals. So I do think they need someone clinical. I think someone like Dominic Calvert-Lewin from Everton. I think Everton are a bag of shite. That's their one really good player now that Richarlison's gone. I do think that he could be a potential interesting signing for Brighton. I would like to see them go in for someone, because I do think they need someone clinical. That being said, they have signed, despite it not showing up here, they have actually signed a striker. Dennis Undav is his name. He's from the Belgium League, and he actually got some good numbers. The reason why he doesn't appear here is because he actually technically signed for them last season and then was immediately loaned back. And he's got some good numbers in Belgium. 26 goals from 37 league games last season, but there's a pretty big difference between the Belgium League and the Premier League. So can he replicate that? I'm not so sure. But that being said, do think Brighton will finish in 11th place. They do need a clinical striker. Just ahead of Brighton, it's going to be Crystal Palace. Crystal Palace will finish in 10th place. Now, Patrick Vieira did a very good job last season. In fact, Crystal Palace were only one of 4 teams who weren't beaten by City in the Premier League, even achieving a very impressive win against City at the Etihad. They've essentially brought in Decore, defensive midfielder, and they've taken out Kiarte, so sort of a like-for-like situation there. Haven't lost any of their main players fundamentally, the likes of Zaha and Eze. I also think that Sam Johnston, I didn't even realise they signed for Palace until I started doing some research for this video. That is a fantastic bit of business, because when West Brom went down in the Premier League, Johnston was one of their only really good players. So I think that is fantastic. But the main issue with Crystal Palace, they just don't take enough shots. And that surprises me, because they've got really fun, creative flair players like Zaha and Eze. If we have a look at the shots total, it doesn't include penalty kicks. Crystal Palace are all the way down here at the bottom. We talked about Wolves and how poor they are in terms of going forward and actually attacking. Norwich and Watford got relegated. Wolves we talked about. But Palace just don't take enough shots. Fair play to them. They did overperform on their XG. You can see here they got an XG of 46.4 and they scored 50 goals. So they did overperform, but just going back to that sustainability point, I'm not sure whether that is sustainable. Ultimately, I do think Palace will need to start shooting more. Maybe they need another option up front. I believe their main options right now are Benteke and Edouard, who got like single-digit goals last season. Again, Calvert-Lewin, I think he could go to one of these clubs and do a really good job there. But that is Crystal Palace. I do think they will finish in 10th place. Slight improvement on last season. In 9th, we're starting to move up the table beyond mediocrity, and it is Leicester who will finish in 9th place. Now, in terms of transfer business, Leicester are bloody boring because they haven't signed anyone. I'm just going to show you. Look at those top arrivals. To be fair, they also haven't sold anyone. I believe the reason why they're not able to sign anyone, or why they haven't signed anyone as of yet, is because that Leicester in recent seasons have spent quite a bit of money. So they are therefore balancing the books. However, what I would say about that is that it's all well and good balancing your books. It's all well and good being a financially stable club. However, everyone else around you is improving. If you stay still whilst everyone is moving forwards, what you're doing there is moving back. So for me, Leicester are at risk of regressing if they don't sign anyone. And I've spoken about overperforming on the last couple of clubs, and Leicester are the worst and therefore the best in terms of overperforming on their XG, which is okay sometimes, but you don't want to overly rely on it, because in general, your XG will catch up with your G. There you go. Leicester scored around an additional 11 goals than they probably should have done. So again, they're at risk of having to rely on that next season. Talented squad, obviously, but I just don't think they've done quite enough to convince me that they can finish any higher than 9th. Rounding off this table, it is West Ham in 8th place. Now, West Ham heavily overperformed last season, and in more ways than one. We were just talking about Leicester heavily overperforming on their XG. West Ham are actually the second best in the league in terms of overperforming. And if we look at the current squad value, they're behind the likes of Everton, Aston Villa, Leicester. Last season, they were ahead of Wolves in terms of squad value, but fundamentally, they did finish ahead of all of them, and actually only 2 points behind the Manchester United side last season, which had a squad value £300 million greater than them. Let's have a look at their arrivals and departures. Crucially, they have been able to keep hold of Declan Rice. These are the main incomings and main departures. They haven't lost anyone. Mark Noble, sentimental reasons, but they haven't actually really lost anyone. Spent over £30 million on this new striker. He was last season in the top 9% of strikers in terms of goals scored per 90, so they could have a proper out-and-out clinical striker. Now, Antonio wasn't necessarily that. I think he's technically a wing-back rather than a striker, so it's good to have that option there. I also think it was important to secure Areola on a permanent. Fabianski's 37 years old now, but I do think that they will drop out of those European places. They'll go from 7th last season to 8th this season, in my opinion. And that's partly because of the potentially unsustainable practices that I've spoken about. It's partly because of the overperforming. It's partly because of the addition of UEFA Conference League football. But the main reason is because of the team that I want to talk about next. And West Ham will get knocked out of the European places by one Newcastle United. They will finish in 7th place. They were 11th last season, which isn't that impressive. However, there's a huge difference between the Newcastle United which started last season and the Newcastle United which ended last season. I'd actually suggest it's basically 2 different teams in 2 different seasons. You can't really compare the two. When Howe was appointed, they had one of the best records in the league in terms of accumulating points. They've managed to get rid of a lot of dead wood, not permanently, apart from Dwight Gale. However, lots of loan transfers for these players who, quite frankly, are not good enough. Poor Burnley have been absolutely raided. Nick Pope as a keeper is actually a really good bit of business. Again, I feel like that's gone slightly under the radar. I do think that will improve Newcastle drastically because Pope actually has some of the best numbers in terms of shot stopping. Only Wolves, United, Liverpool and West Ham better than Burnley. Compare that to Newcastle. Look at the difference between the two in terms of the performances of the goalkeepers. And also something that's not really talked enough about Nick Pope. So the number of defensive actions he does outside of his penalty area is actually the same as Alisson. In terms of the other business, they brought in Botman. He was a league winner with Lille. It's a lot of money. It is £30 million, but he did play nearly every game for Lille in the league title win the year. I wouldn't be surprised at all if Newcastle actually bought more players this summer and in the January transfer window. This will be the season. This will be the start of Newcastle's long-term journey to progressing and becoming a new member of that top six. Manchester United are rubbish, and that is why they will finish in 6th place. I can make a whole video about the issues at Man United. In fact, I've made a few. But let's start with the players that they have sold. And there is some good work here. There are some promising signs here. As with Newcastle, there is a lot of dead wood that has gone out of the club. Paul Pogba, don't care what you think about him. He's not as good as you think he is. He is dead wood. Lingard, dead wood. Henderson, bit of a troublemaker. He's gone out on a loan, probably long-term permanently. Pereira, forgot he existed. Deadwood. Matic, he's about 97 years old and has got the legs of someone without any legs. So good to get rid of them. However, these are the arrivals. These are the arrivals, and I don't think it's inspired at all. In fact, to be honest, I think it's a bit shambolic. I'm not just saying this because I'm a City fan. The main transfer target, the player who they've been courting and flirting with for approximately 82 years, does not even want to play for them, and they are obsessing over them. But also, he's not even the key player that they need. They need a number 6. They need a proper defensive midfielder. Frankie de Jong is not that. And with Matic leaving, there is now no senior, recognised, out-and-out defensive midfielder at the club, unless you want to include Garner, who played for Forest last season, I believe the season before that. Do we honestly think he's ready to compete for the top 4 and play for Manchester United? Overall, the incomings, in my opinion, aren't that inspired, to be honest. Over £50 million could be an interesting long-term option, but is he immediately going to improve the starting 11? Long-term thinking, maybe, sure. But short-term, Manchester United are still a bag of shite, it seems. Eriksen on a free transfer. He doesn't improve the starting 11. He's not going to start over Bruno Fernandes. I don't see any reality in which Fernandes and Eriksen can play at the same time, in the same team, in the same starting 11. The left back from Feyenoord, I mean, he might be better than Telles and Shaw, but that's not saying much. The squad is still imbalanced. The squad is still uninspired. Ronaldo wants to leave. It's almost as if signing him was bad business. Oh, I wonder who predicted that at the start of the season. Loads of people mocked him for saying it. The main transfer target doesn't even want to join. It's probably going to be another year of McFred somehow, and I would be genuinely staggered and amazed if they actually challenged for top 4. Ten Hag is an interesting managerial appointment. I think it's a good appointment, maybe the best they could have made, but I still think he's going to fail at United through no fault of his own, but because the club is a basket case. Arsenal will once again miss out on Champions League football. They'll finish in 5th. If we have a look at their transfer activity, they haven't lost anyone too important, which is very important. I never really rated Lacazette. These are the players who have gone this season, but there are very exciting incomings in the form of Manchester City players in particular. Gabriel Jesus, Alexander Zinchenko. Arteta essentially trying to create a mini Man City with these players. I think these are fantastic signings, getting players who aren't quite good enough to start week in, week out at City, but who can still do a job for City and who are good enough to start for Arsenal. I think it's really good business. I don't know nearly enough about Fabio Vieira to comment on him in absolute terms, but he looks like an exciting bit of business as well. Also, it's not listed here because he was signed last season or the season before, but William Saliba is going to be a really interesting player. Been on Marseille at loan. However, his stats in terms of passing are really impressive. Only Cancelo's attempted more passes. Only Laporte surpasses Saliba in terms of the distance of those passes. And he's also got a very high success rate in terms of passing, whether it's short, medium, or long distance. It's all between 85 and 95%. It's all very impressive stuff. He could potentially become a very important ball-playing centre-half for Arteta's Arsenal. I think a front 4 of Saka, Jesus, Martinelli, and then Odegaard as that sort of number 10. That could be really exciting as a forward force. I also just like Arteta as a manager. I like the signings. I like the squad overall. It's looking much healthier, but I do still think they would just miss out on the top 4, because the team that'll be finishing 4th in the Premier League next season, it's Chelsea. Now, Chelsea should have been title challengers last season, genuine title challengers. I predicted them to finish in 2nd and really competing with City for the title. However, ultimately, they failed. They failed at challenging for the title. Now, why is that? Why is that? They finished in 3rd, and Chelsea sort of occupied this weird area of being a lot better than everyone else below them, but still being nowhere near Manchester City. They only finished 3 points ahead of Spurs, but almost 20 points off top spot City. And the reason for that, it's pretty simple. They don't score enough goals. This is the league table if we're doing it by goals. City scored the most. Liverpool scored a good amount as well, 94. Chelsea didn't score a poor amount. They scored 76. But at the end of the day, it's still around 20 fewer than City and Liverpool, which is where they're trying to get to. It's only 7 more than 4th place Spurs. It's much closer to Spurs, Leicester, Arsenal, West Ham. And that's despite outperforming their XG quite significantly. Their XG was around 70 last season. They actually scored 73. Lukaku was arguably the worst transfer last season in terms of the expectation, what he was required to do for Chelsea. They brought in Raheem Sterling. Now, that is a fantastic signing. That could go down as one of the signings of the season. I really rate Sterling. He's a fantastic player. Koulibaly also should be a very good signing. Lots of talk about him. I feel like for the past 5-6 years, Premier League teams have been linked with him. Finally gets a move to the Premier League. It'll be really interesting to see how he performs in the Premier League. But they do need to do much more. They were linked with Rafinha. They were linked with Koundé. They've both gone to Barca. They've lost Rudiger. And they've lost Christensen. Now, whatever you think of those as players, on free transfers as well, by the way, didn't even make any money from that. They've lost 2 centre-halves, and they brought in 1. So immediately, they need at least 1 more centre-half in order to just balance that loss. They've been heavily linked with Cucurella from Brighton. Chelsea potentially wanting to match Brighton's £50 million valuation, and that is a good option because Cucurella can play as a left wing back, he can play as a left back, he can play on the left side of a back 3 because he is left footed. That's what Chelsea are after. Koulibaly, I believe, also plays on the left hand side, but he's not left footed. This isn't enough. It looks like quite a bit of money, nearly £90 million, but the huge chasm between City and Liverpool and Chelsea in terms of overall quality, it's just too much, and they haven't done nearly enough to become title challengers. Spurs are going to have a really good season. They are going to finish in 3rd, and they are going to potentially challenge for the title. They're going to overtake Chelsea, and here's why. They have a better manager than Chelsea. They've had a better transfer window than Chelsea, and Spurs also have at least 2 players who are more than capable of scoring over 20 Premier League goals in a season. They're not going to properly challenge for the title. Like, I do think they'll be out of the title race when it comes to the last day of the season, but they're not going to be too far off. They'll maybe be there in the 2nd or 3rd to last game of the season. Bergwijn's gone. He was never good enough. He was always a substitute player. It seemed irrelevant. Nearly 30 million for him. That's fine. Get him out of here, to be honest. Let's talk about the arrivals. They haven't lost anyone else. Harry Kane is still here. Son is still here. Basuma, I talked about him when we talked about Brighton. He was one of Brighton's best players. He goes straight into the starting 11 and he improves it. Let's also talk about Longley. Might go a little bit under the radar, but it does mean now that Conte finally has 3 proper, true out-and-out centre-halves to call on. He's got Romero, he's got Sanchez, and now he has Longley. There's also the option around Davis and Dyer there as well. In fact, that's how they played last season, but these are proper out-and-out centre-halves now. And getting Spence from Borough, that's another interesting option at right wing-back. But for me, the most interesting signing is actually Ivan Perisic. He's 33 now, so he's getting on a bit. However, when Conte won Serie A with Inter Milan, Perisic was his left wing back. So we are seeing Spurs become more of an Antonio Conte side. I do think they've slightly overpaid for Richarlison, over £50 million for him, but I can see why they've signed him. And ultimately, this will be Conte's 2nd season at Spurs and his 1st full season at Spurs, and the team is becoming much more like a Conte team. I think in another year, Conte will turn Spurs into title challengers, but for now, I've got them in 3rd. Who's going to finish 2nd in the Premier League, and therefore who's going to win the Premier League? I got one prediction right last season, and that was Man City to be title winners, and I'm going to predict the exact same thing. Manchester City are going to win the title. Liverpool are going to come 2nd. Now, Liverpool were the 2nd best team in the world last season, so ultimately the question is, have they done enough to close the gap on City? The most notable outgoing is Sadio Mane, but they did replace him actually last season with Luis Diaz. Most notably, of course, It is Darwin, I believe it's pronounced Nunez. Completely different player to any of their other options at striker. Firmino wears the number 9, but he is not a typical number 9 by any means. Carvalho is a very young player. He's barely played in the Premier League for Fulham, so I'm not sure he's going to have too much of an impact on the title race. The question therefore becomes, does getting rid of Mane and bringing in Nunez improve Liverpool and make them better than City? Now, I think it does improve them overall as a team, although interestingly, the squad value for Liverpool has gone down since the end of last season. All that being said, I just don't think that bringing in Nunez, selling Mane is going to be enough to close that gap. Liverpool last season were, compared to the other top 4 sides, the worst in terms of getting points out of the other top 4 sides. They couldn't beat anyone. I do think Liverpool will win more games this season than last season because of the addition of Darwin Nunez. But ultimately, the reason why I think Liverpool won't win the league is for a very simple fact. That's because I think City will beat them to it. I think Manchester City win the Premier League. City scored the most goals last season, 99, and they did that without a proper striker. And what's happened at City? They've signed one of the best, exciting young strikers in the world. Let's take a look at their whole transfer window. They've signed Erling Haaland for a relative bargain, I think it's fair to say. He is one of the best strikers in the world. He consistently outperforms his XG. Only the best players like Messi, Ronaldo, Kane, Mbappe, Lewandowski do that year on year. Haaland also does it. This is a player who's scored 41 goals in 41 games in a season for Dortmund before, and I'd be staggered if City didn't score more goals with Erling Haaland in their team than without him. Cities tend to struggle against opposition sides who deploy a really, really low block, who just want to do nothing other than camp. Think of Burnley last season or even Wolves. They've just got no intent or desire when they come up against City to do any sort of attacking. Everyone is back, which is fair enough because it's City, you'd be scared. And normally what that does is it congests the middle of the field, which is where City often get a lot of their joy and creativity from. And it means that you've got to go out wide. And it means that quite often you've got to resort to crossing the ball aimlessly into the box. And who's in the box for City, if anyone? It's a 5'8" Bernardo Silva. It's maybe Phil Foden. It's maybe Kevin De Bruyne. Maybe it's Rodri, but often it's barely anyone, and certainly barely anyone tall, strong, good in the air. Haaland is around 6'5", very strong, very clinical, and I think literally will be the perfect player for those sorts of situations. And also, City win a penalty last season and indeed the season before that. Whenever City get a penalty, I'm not convinced at all it's going to go in the back of the net. Haaland, I think he's only missed 2 of however many penalties he scored. I think he scored 26 penalties and only missed 2. So he's got a really good penalty record. Again, those are just 3 goals for City. Alvarez is another interesting player. He's not here in arrivals because he technically arrived last season, then went back straight out on loan to River Plate, but he's another good option either centrally or I do think more so on the right, natural right foot, potentially crossing in the ball for Haaland. On that right-hand side, he'll basically replace Jesus as that utility forward. Fernandinho has been replaced by Calvin Phillips. That's he'd start in defensive midfield for a lot of Premier League sides, so the fact that City have got him as a backup is excellent. Stefan's gone. Stefan's come in. Backup goalkeeper, it's whatever. The good thing about Sterling was that he could play across all forward 3 areas for City, but City have got Foden and Grealish who can play on the left. And they got Mahrez, Alvarez, Palmer, Bernardo Silva who can play on the right, and they got loads of players who can play centrally as well. So I don't think Sterling actually needs to be replaced. Zinchenko, though, does. He absolutely needs to be replaced. We might be going into another season where City still, 5 years now, City still don't have a proper nominal left-back. Cancelo left-back is good. It's brilliant. He was the best left-back in the league last season, even though he's a right-back. However, if Walker is injured, then it means that Cancelo has to move to the right, and then it means that there's no senior player who can play on the left. Ake can technically play there. Laporte can technically play there, but you wouldn't want, especially against someone like Liverpool or Spurs or Chelsea or one of the top sides, you wouldn't want them at left back. So another option does need to be there. There is a young player called Wilson Esbrand, I think it's pronounced. He could be a decent option. He's an academy player. Do you really want to risk Walker or Cancelo getting suspended or getting injured and then having to rely on Wilson Esbrand? I'm not sure you do. So the fact that City aren't getting Cucurella could be a bit of an issue. But as long as they get someone, I think City will be fine. I don't think City fail to win the title unless something outrageous happens, like they suffer crippling injuries, or Haaland gets injured for 6 months, something like that. Because last season City were the best team in the league, and they've actually improved the squad. They've added a striker. They technically in theory, added goals when they were already the top goal scorers. It might just take them a bit of time to get used to playing with a proper out-and-out number 9. City have never had a player like Haaland, essentially, in the modern Premier League era. He's nothing like Aguero was. He's nothing like how any of City's midfielders or wide players play as a striker, as a false 9. He is just an out-and-out, clinical, proper number 9. So it might take the team just a few games to get used to that. In fact, in the Charity Shield, in the Community Shield, for example, there were so many times when Haaland, by the way, Haaland actually had quite a good game in the Community Shield. I know that, I appreciate that he did miss a sitter at the end, but if you actually watch the game, then you'll appreciate that Haaland actually did play quite well. So he made so many really good runs, really dangerous runs, and if De Bruyne, who didn't have a good game, if he just played the long ball first time, more direct, then Haaland would have been, in, essentially. And he'd have only had Van Dijk to beat in terms of pace, and Haaland is beating Van Dijk in the foot race. So I do think that once the team get used to that, City will be deadly. De Bruyne will get so many assists. Haaland will get so many goals. City will get so many goals. And ultimately, I do think that City will win the title, but for any crippling injuries. It will be close between City and Liverpool. It's not going to be a huge gap by any means. Liverpool have improved, or City have improved. I don't think that Liverpool have improved more than City when they needed to, because last season City were already better. Those are my Premier League predictions. Man City will retain the title. And here are some bonus Premier League predictions. We'll have a look at this and see how wrong I am at the end of the season. But I've got Harry Kane to score the most goals. Trent will get the most assists. Sancho will be the most improved player and the one to watch. The best signing of the season will be Darwin Núñez. The worst signing of the season will be Jesse Lingard. The best player of the season will be Kevin De Bruyne. And the best young player of the season will be Erling Haaland, who does qualify for the Young Player of the Year award because he was 21 before the 1st of July. He's only recently become 22. His birthday is in late July, so he does qualify for that award. But let me know your predictions in terms of the actual table. Which ones do you agree with? Which ones do you heavily disagree with? Hope you enjoyed the video. Hope you enjoyed the format. Let me know what you think of the aerial bird's eye view. I know it's not perfect, but I'm not Sky Sports. I'm not BT Sport. I'm LNobbins, and I've got a desk. That is what I have to work with, but hopefully you like the concept. Hopefully you like the format. Please make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel if you're new, share the video with someone you know if you liked it or didn't like it. I don't care, just share it. And I'll see you next time.